Real talk, I can't even remotely remember the last time a game's left me with as many conflicting feelings as what Bayonetta 3 has. Announced back in 2017 during the Game Awards, Bayonetta 3 had it kinda rough during its development. For starters, its director, Yusuke Hashimoto, left the company a few years into the game's development. The game was also apparently being developed as a semi-open world title for a little while, but due to technical issues they had to switch back to the more linear level design mid-development. Then 2020 happened, and I don't think I need to remind you why that was a massive problem. Thanks to all of this, it took until the summer of 2021, 3.5-ish years after its announcement, for us to see any actual gameplay for Bayonetta 3. After a little more than a year, the game was finally released, and people were kinda split on it. Most people loved the gameplay like usual, but the story really did not sit well with some people. And in case you couldn't tell by what I said at the start, having now played it for myself, I can definitely see where these people are coming from. And let's just say we've got a lot to unpack here. Bayonetta 3 starts off pretty differently compared to past entries. Here we see Bayonetta in her design from the first game facing off against a shadowy entity in a completely destroyed New York City. Unfortunately, she ends up losing the fight and dying, so another woman named Viola uses a device called a World Gate to travel to an alternate reality to get help from this universe's Bayonetta. In short, a group of artificially made bioweapons called Homunculus and their leader Singularity are attempting to destroy and absorb each parallel reality in the human realm into his own home reality, the Alphaverse. By doing so, Singularity will gain the power necessary to completely destroy both Inferno and Paradiso as well, thus wiping out all of existence. So with Viola's help, Bayonetta travels to the island of Thule with the goal of finding 4 Chaos Gears and the few remaining realities in the multiverse, so she can head to the Alphaverse and take down Singularity. Anything in that summary that has you confused at all? Don't worry, you're not alone there, because in certain areas I'm just as confused as you probably are. The story can be a little confusing in places, and I would go as far as to say that the multiverse aspect of the story feels a bit out of place. I mean, previously we were dealing with angelic and eventually demonic forces by using dark magic and infernal weaponry. Now we're dealing with universe hopping and destroying bioweapons that design-wise would feel right at home in something like Astral Chain. It all just feels a bit off, like it belongs in a different game. On a similar note though, does anyone else think the writing for Bayonetta herself feels a bit off? Like, she seems more subdued in 3 than she does in past games. I still like her, but she doesn't feel quite the same character as before, and not in a good way. I don't want to go too deep into it here, because if I do, we'll start getting into spoilers, so let's just say I'm not a fan of the story this time around. But I do like the new character of Viola. I don't particularly enjoy how the story handles or treats her, but I do like her. Before we move on though, I will say I'm not too fond of the designs for the homunculus. The general aesthetic is something I enjoy, but the color palette is too repetitive. The white and teal in and of itself is nice, but I don't like that all of them have it. They also just lack personality, and some of them are kinda boring. Compare them to the angels as well as demons, and they just feel oddly plain. Like early in the game it's stated that they're part human, but you wouldn't really know that looking at them. Honestly, it feels like they could have done a lot more with them than what they did. With them being part human and having some Buddhist inspirations behind them, there's a lot you can do here for cool looking and even freaky looking designs. It's a shame and kind of disappointing, especially given how important they are to the story, but hey, at least they're fun to beat up, am I right? Bayonetta 3's gameplay actually makes plenty of changes this time around compared to the last 2 games. For starters, unlike previous entries where you had a weapon on both your hands and feet per set, you instead only have one. And if I'm being honest here, this system is better than what we had before. Each weapon in Bayonetta's arsenal has a much more expansive and unique moveset that makes them all even more fun and interesting to use than in previous games. And much to my surprise, you can even upgrade them too. In a new and very welcome change for the series, you can use demon orbs you earn in battle to upgrade each of Bayonetta's weapons by unlocking new moves on its respective skill tree. And thankfully, despite there being more than 12 total weapons in the game, you don't really have to grind at all. You'll have more than enough orbs to unlock plenty of new moves for your arsenal, amongst other things, but more on that later. Now, because of how many weapons there are, and that there are only 14 numbered chapters in the game, I wasn't able to fully use all of them for this video. So instead of going over all of them, I'm just gonna discuss a couple of my favorites. This game's basic guns, Color My World, were very fun to use, and at least design-wise, might be my favorite ones. The expanded moveset Bayonetta's guns have this time around make them very versatile to use. Like there wasn't a situation where they weren't effective. The Ignis RNA Yo-Yo was more fun to use than I was expecting. Its attacks are incredibly fast with a lot of great range, and it just feels super good to fight with. Frankly, out of every weapon I really used, this one is definitely my favorite. The fans, Simoon, while lacking in power, make up for it with how fast they are. You'll be able to rack up a ton of hits for combo points with these things, and they even have my personal favorite Demon Masquerade in the game, with these giving you the ability to glide around an area. See, this time around, by using the Demon Masquerade, Bayonetta can fuse the demon based on whatever weapon she has equipped. While this is used for certain attacks in combat, they're more importantly used for getting around and exploration. There are like 12 of these forms, so I can't go over all of them, but let's just say this is an idea I actually really like. It gives Bayonetta and her demons more of a synergy to them, and lets all of them feel more like a tool in her arsenal instead of just a finisher. And on that note, let's finally get to this game's big new mechanic, Demon Slave. See, because the homunculus are part human and not an angel or another demon, Bayonetta's infernal contacts refuse to fight them of their own volition. So to remedy this, she utilizes the lost magic art of Demon Slave in order to force them to fight in combat with her. And honestly, I really love this. At any time in combat, you can summon one of 3 equipped demons by pressing ZL. From here, you can make them attack just like you would Bayonetta herself. And just like her weapons, you can also upgrade them with new attacks. You can, of course, just summon them and wreck house, but that leaves Bayonetta vulnerable since while you're holding the summon button, she can't attack. A good way to use them is by quickly summoning one for an attack in between combos or as a finisher. Some of my favorite demons were Phantasmarene for his web fire attack combo, Madama Butterfly for her quick and powerful strikes, and the Bat, whose name I'm not even gonna attempt to pronounce, for his dash and lightning attacks. We're not quite done going over the combat though, because this time around we have a new playable character for the story with Viola. Unlike Bayonetta, Viola only gets one weapon, her katana Mabudachi, and one demon with her friend Cheshire. Unlike the normal demons though, Cheshire fights of his own free will and not through Demon Slave, so you also can't control him at all. The biggest difference though is that she triggers witch time through parrying instead of dodging. Let me tell you, after having spent 30 plus hours over the course of a few weeks playing these games, now suddenly having to block to activate witch time really threw me off. I had to fight so much muscle memory when I played as her. Beyond that though, she was really fun to play as once I unlocked more of her moveset. She was a bit tricky to get the hang of at first because of how different she was, but after a chapter or two, I really enjoyed playing as her. I do wish Viola had more than 3 chapters to herself though. So, to sum it up, I love 3's combat. It's different from the previous games, but in a way I really enjoyed. It's overall very fun, but now we need to get into Bayonetta 3's issues, and unfortunately, I'm not going to be all that positive for, like, the rest of the video. To start with, I do have a couple smaller issues. First off, some areas feel a bit bigger in size than necessary. I understand that it's probably a leftover from the game's original open-world aspects, but it does kinda hurt the pacing at points. Secondly, some of the optional challenge verses in 3 are pretty annoying this time around. Anything with tricky terrain as a hazard felt obnoxious to deal with, and Viola's witch time only challenges really frustrated me. Most of the time when it triggered for her, it would barely stay up for more than a second. Only like 20% of the time did I get the full 5 or 6 seconds to beat down on an enemy. I know for a fact it's not a glitch, so as a genuine question for those of you watching that do understand the inner workings of witch time in 3, I would love to know what it is I'm doing wrong here, because I'm totally lost. The best way to sum up my largest and overall only major issue with Bayonetta 3's gameplay though, is that it doesn't feel totally focused. You see, in the first 2 Bayonettas, we had a couple of gimmick chapters. Parts of a game that, for better or worse, had a one-off new gameplay style you had to play with for most of the level. These weren't necessarily great, but they were a one-off thing that only lasted about 7 or 8 minutes at worst. In Bayonetta 3, however, we don't have gimmick chapters, we have gimmick sections that are far more frequent. Now, don't get me wrong here though, some of them were genuinely fun. The shooter sections with the Bat Demon and against Pyrocumulus were pretty cool, even if the former was maybe a bit too long. And I really liked a couple of the game's kaiju fights, like with Phantasmarene and Ball. But having so many of these is entirely unnecessary. I and most people playing Bayonetta 3 are here for an action game, and while having 2 or 3 sections like this are fine, there's a point where it starts actively detracting from the experience for me. There are a good few points where I would love to just have a normal boss fight with a cool looking enemy, but we get a mini-game instead. And that really sucks because Bayonetta 3 has some genuinely really great boss fights, like easily some of my favorite in the series. And if I'm being honest, I also have a hard time wanting to replay chapters this time around. I'll use the checkpoints they introduced here to go back and find some verses that I missed, but when I think about fully replaying a chapter, I just lose interest. which is a shame because there's actually 14 shorter extra stages in the game you can unlock by finding every Umbran tier in a chapter. They give out some pretty sweet rewards like accessories and even weapons as well as demons. Heck, you can even fight returning bosses from the first 2 games like Fortitudo, but honestly after about 3 of these I lost interest because catching the bird and cat familiars can be a bit of a pain from my experience. Honestly though, I hate saying all this because Bayonetta 3's combat is some of the most fun I've had in this series, but the game doesn't really focus on that as much as it probably should. That being said, as many of you already know, none of this is even the game's largest issue, which means now it's time for spoilers, so skip to the next chapter or the timestamp here to avoid that. With that being said, let's finally get into this. The story of 3 has a lot of problems, so in order to prevent this video from becoming longer than necessary, I'm just gonna focus on my personal biggest issues with it. Starting with how oddly repetitive and even bland it is. Like, in a story about traveling the multiverse, why is it that every alternate reality is just, it's Bayonetta, but now she's a different nationality? You could have done so many more interesting things with it, especially with how each one ends. Look, I get it, for the story to happen the Archives have to die, but why is it always functionally the same setup? It always ends up with that version of Bayonetta getting killed from behind or something along those lines, with the only exception being Egyptian Bayo. You know what, on the subject of death though, can we talk about how Jeanne dying actually makes no sense with how it's set up? And I'm not even talking about how she could have easily dodged that laser tentacle. Like, Bayonetta herself gets impaled by Strider and she rips her own heart out multiple times in this game and walks it off. How does this wound kill Jeanne, whom I must remind you, is about as strong a witch as Bayonetta? I may not like that she died, but you could have at least killed her in a full-on fight and not in a backstabbing that by the game's and the whole series' own example should not have killed her. And then we have these two. Now, maybe I just missed some kind of very subtle hint at how these two actually feel about each other, but am I alone in thinking that Bayonetta having feelings for Luca and vice versa makes absolutely no sense? Don't get me wrong, I'm not against the idea of them being a thing, but at least from my perspective, this wasn't set up well at all. Like, I'm honestly not even sure what more to say about this point. I genuinely do not understand why these two suddenly have feelings for each other. And finally, we have Viola. Now, as a character, I do like her personality, but like I said earlier, I do not enjoy how the story handles or treats her. For starters, she doesn't do that much in the story, like her chapters don't contribute that much to the plot aside from introducing fairies into the lore. What makes this worse though is how in the game's epilogue, they just decide to give her the title of Bayonetta after Cereza dies. Like, I'm not against the idea of Viola inheriting the title at some point, but this is not how you handle that. I mean, it just feels so unearned, like they spent basically the whole game making jokes at her expense and showing how despite clearly being strong, she has a lot to learn. So why after all that do you decide to just hand her the title so quickly? You could have so easily had an entire game dedicated to having her prove her worth and inheriting the title by the end, which would have been way more satisfying, but no, they decided to totally jump the gun here. I really hate saying this because I think Viola will make for a great protagonist come Bayonetta 4, but by handling her the way they did, not only did Platinum give everyone a bad first impression of our successor, they also completely missed the opportunity to truly have her earn the title first. I suppose to end this out on at least one positive note though, I loved the boss fights with Strider in every Singularity fight, barring his first form. They're genuinely awesome, and Singularity Definition, despite being a very meh villain, is my favorite final boss in the series, easily. Bayonetta 3 really frustrated me for a lot of reasons. Its gameplay is bogged down by a lot of unnecessary minigames, and then there's the story and writing in almost its entirety. Despite that though, I still really liked it. The combat is incredibly fun as always, and I love the new changes and additions to the game like with Demon Slave. While I wish they would have done a bit more with Viola, I did really enjoy playing as her, and the relationship she has with Cheshire was pretty charming. I can't blame anyone if they were still disappointed or straight up just didn't like the game though. For as great as the gameplay is, I can easily see why a few of Bayonetta 3's issues would be pretty hard to put aside for some. With any luck though, Platinum will have taken all this into consideration for Bayonetta 4, because after playing through nearly every game in the series now, I can say for certain they can do better than this, for as harsh as that may sound. Until next time, thank you all for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I hope you all have a nice day.